It has been exactly 50 years since three men pulled off perhaps the most audacious prison break in history, escaping like Houdini from Alcatraz, never to be seen again.
The fog of San Francisco Bay once swallowed secrets whole, but 55 years later, a ghost has emerged from the machine. In 1962, three men vanished from Alcatraz using raincoat rafts and soap-carved decoys, leaving the FBI to presume them drowned.
All three prisoners have vanished from their cells, with three lifelike papier-mâché heads left behind.
Immediately, this creates chaos. These prisoners are gone. How could these prisoners have escaped this super security?
Yet, a breakthrough in 2020 changed everything. Using advanced AI facial recognition on a long-lost 1975 Brazilian photograph, analysts found a 90% match for the Anglin brothers, suggesting the impossible escape was merely the beginning of a half-century masquerade. Did they make it out of the water then? A 90% match. The FBI relied on a simple, chilling assumption for decades. The Pacific Ocean does not give up its prisoners. When Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped into the black, 50 degrees Fahrenheit chop of San Francisco Bay on June 11, 1962, the official narrative froze alongside them. Investigators pointed to the lethal currents and the lack of verifiable sightings as proof of a watery grave. However, the 2020 application of sophisticated facial recognition algorithms, specifically deep learning neural networks, shattered this institutional certainty. By processing a grainy, sun-bleached photograph taken in Brazil in 1975, AI has effectively resurrected the Anglin brothers from the dead, providing the first mathematical evidence that the most famous prison break in American history was a success. The photograph in question was provided by Fred Brizzi, a childhood friend of the Anglins, who claimed to have bumped into the brothers at a bar near Rio de Janeiro 13 years after their escape. In the image, two men stand in the tropical heat, sporting shaggy hair and large sunglasses, looking more like weary expatriates than federal fugitives. While human eyes struggled with the low resolution and the effects of time, the AI saw through the noise. Unlike traditional forensics, which might rely on a sketch artist's intuition, the facial recognition software utilized feature extraction to map the fundamental geometry of the men's faces. It analyzed the distance between the pupils, the specific curvature of the jawline, and the unique proportions of the nasal bridge, constants that remain largely unchanged by the passage of time or the growth of facial hair. The results were staggering. The algorithm returned a probability match of over 90% for both John and Clarence Anglin. In the world of forensic AI, this kind of match is not a mere suggestion, it is a digital fingerprint. To achieve this, the system compared the 1975 image against the brothers' 1962 mugshots, accounting for 13 years of biological aging, weight fluctuation, and sun exposure. The AI's ability to de-age and re-age subjects allows it to ignore the surface-level distractions of 70s fashion and focus on the underlying skeletal structure. It suggests that the men in that Brazilian field were not lookalikes or coincidental strangers, but the very same convicts who had tunneled through the salt-rotted concrete of Alcatraz using nothing but sharpened spoons and sheer desperation. This technological revelation does more than just update a cold case. It exposes the limitations of 20th-century investigative techniques. The FBI officially closed its file in 1979, citing a lack of credible evidence of survival. Yet, the AI has demonstrated that the evidence was always there, it simply required a more advanced eye to see it. This breakthrough has forced a radical shift in the U.S. Marshals' perspective, moving the investigation from a search for remains to a hunt for living centenarians. The data implies that the Anglins didn't just survive the swim, they successfully navigated an international transit, likely hopping freighter ships or using forged documents to reach the safety of South America's fugitive trail. By validating the Brizzi photograph, the AI has effectively bridged the gap between conspiracy theory and forensic fact. It turns a legendary myth into a verifiable historical event, suggesting that the rock was not as inescapable as the government led the public to believe. This 90% match serves as a digital indictment of the original investigation, proving that while the men vanished from their cells, they never actually left the world. While the AI has confirmed their survival in the tropics, the true genius of their disappearance lies back in the dark, crumbling corridors of the prison itself. The perfect blueprint. The digital ghost in Brazil only exists because of the analog genius displayed within the damp, salt-corroded walls of Alcatraz. To understand how the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris reached a life of tropical exile, one must dissect the sheer architectural brilliance of their 1962 departure. This was not a desperate scramble for the fences. It was a masterclass in improvised engineering and psychological warfare against the most secure facility in the federal system. The trio recognized that Alcatraz was not just a prison of bars and concrete, but a prison of routine and sound. To beat it, they had to become invisible while standing in plain sight, using the very materials provided for their incarceration to manufacture their liberation. The cornerstone of the perfect blueprint was the creation of the dummy heads, morbid, lifelike decoys that sat in their cots while the men worked in the shadows. Crafted from a mixture of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, and toilet paper, these effigies were topped with real human hair gathered from the barbershop floor. By placing these heads under their blankets, the escapees exploited the psychological blind spot of the night guards, who performed head counts based on silhouettes rather than biological confirmation. While the guards paced the tiers, convinced their charges were dreaming, Morris and the Anglins were feet away, widening the ventilation ducts behind their cells. They used discarded saw blades and spoons reinforced with silver solder from a stolen vacuum cleaner, grinding away at the moisture-weakened masonry for over 6 months in a rhythmic, patient assault. However, the true engineering marvel was the raft. Navigating the 1.25-mile stretch of the San Francisco Bay required more than just a piece of wood. It required a vessel capable of withstanding riptides and frigid swells. Using over 50 standard-issue rubberized raincoats, the men utilized the heat from the prison's steam pipes to vulcanize the seams together, creating a primitive but effective inflatable catamaran. They even built a bellows out of a concertina, a small accordion, to inflate the craft once they reached the shoreline. This wasn't just a makeshift float. It was a bespoke maritime vehicle designed specifically for the unique hydrodynamics of the bay. They had calculated the tides, the wind resistance, and the buoyancy required to carry 3 grown men and their supplies across a channel that had claimed dozens of previous aspirants. The blueprint extended beyond the physical tools to the timing of the tides. They didn't just leave when they were ready. They waited for the slack water window, a brief period where the current's ferocity subsides. This level of preparation suggests a high degree of intelligence, particularly from Frank Morris, whose IQ was tested at 133, well into the superior range. They turned the prison's internal utilities into their personal workshop, hiding their progress behind false walls made of painted cardboard. Every detail, from the stolen plywood paddles to the makeshift life vests, was a middle finger to the Bureau of Prisons. They had solved the physical puzzle of the rock long before they ever touched the water, proving that the mind is a far more effective tool than any contraband shiv or smuggled file. As the last valve on the concertina bellows hissed shut, the men stepped into a black abyss, where the only thing colder than the water was the silence of their departure. The night of the vanishing. The silence of Alcatraz at 9:30 p.m. on June 11, 1962, was a heavy, artificial thing, broken only by the rhythmic scuff of a guard's boots on the Michigan Avenue corridor. Behind the bars of cells 138, 140, and 144, the dummy heads lay nestled in coarse wool blankets, their painted eyes closed in a permanent waxen sleep. In the suffocating darkness of the utility crawl space, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were finally breathing the air of a world without locks. They squeezed through the widened ventilation holes, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds, and began the vertical ascent. Climbing the maze of heating pipes and plumbing stacks, they reached the roof, shimmying up a massive kitchen vent to emerge under a canopy of San Francisco fog. The night was a monochromatic blur of salt spray and shadows. Moving with the practiced stealth of apex predators, the trio hauled their 50-pound rubberized raft and makeshift paddles across the roof's edge. They slid 50 feet down a massive exterior drain pipe, landing silently on the damp earth near the prison's power plant. This was the dead zone, a strip of land supposedly covered by the watchful eyes of tower guards. Yet the men moved undetected, shielded by the very mist that was supposed to make the crossing lethal. They reached the northeastern shore, a jagged lip of rock where the Pacific roared in protest. With the concertina bellows wheezing in the dark, they inflated the raincoat skin vessel, the hiss of air the only testament to their defiance. At approximately 10 p.m., the raft tasted the brine. The water was a staggering 54 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature designed to trigger cold shock and cardiac arrest within minutes of immersion. Yet, as they pushed off into the swirling whitecaps, the men didn't panic. They paddled. The current was an invisible giant, tugging the raft toward the Golden Gate Bridge, but the Anglin's childhood experience navigating the swamps of Florida proved to be their greatest asset. They fought the tide, angling their plywood paddles to catch the drift toward Angel Island. Behind them, the lighthouse beam of the rock swept the empty waves, missing the low-profile craft by a matter of yards. They were no longer convicts. They were three shadows dissolved into the vast, indifferent belly of the bay. As the lights of the prison faded into a distant, amber glow, the transition from fugitives to ghosts was completed in the silence of the sea. The presumed dead fallacy. The official verdict of 1979 was a masterpiece of institutional convenience. When the FBI closed its case, citing the high probability of drowning, it relied on a narrative of biological inevitability. No man, they argued, could survive the thermal shock of the San Francisco Bay for more than 20 minutes. This presumed dead status served as a tidy closure for a bureau embarrassed by a breach of its most formidable fortress. However, this conclusion was built upon a foundation of selective evidence and flawed oceanography. The bureau pointed to a floating paddle found near Angel Island and a wallet belonging to the Anglins recovered in the water as proof of a nautical disaster. In reality, these items were more likely tactical debris, decoy markers dropped by the escapees to lead searchers away from their true landing point. Furthermore, the hypothermia argument ignores the physical resilience of the subjects. The Anglin brothers were not city-dwelling amateurs. They were seasoned outdoorsmen raised in the brutal marshes of Florida, where they had spent their youth swimming in treacherous currents and navigating swamps. Their bodies were acclimated to physical hardship, and their raincoat raft provided a crucial barrier between their skin and the soul-crushing cold of the Pacific. Most damning to the FBI's theory was the 2014 study by Dutch scientists using high-resolution hydraulic modeling. The study proved that if the trio launched at exactly 11:30 p.m., the peak of the ebb tide, the currents would not have swept them out to sea to drown. Instead, the water would have naturally pushed their craft toward the north tower of the Golden Gate Bridge and onto the shores of Marin County. The fallacy of their death was a narrative designed to preserve the Rock's reputation as an inescapable tomb. By declaring the men dead without a single body, bone, or shred of clothing recovered, the government engaged in a decades-long game of absence of evidence is evidence of absence. They ignored the reports of a blue Chevrolet stolen in Marin County that same night by 3 men, and they discounted the numerous sightings that began trickling in from the south. The presumed dead label was not a scientific fact. It was a hopeful epitaph for a mystery the FBI simply couldn't solve with the tools of the 70s. While the American authorities were busy writing obituaries for ghosts, a different story was being captured through a camera lens thousands of miles away in the sweltering heat of Brazil. The Brazilian Trail. The humid air of 1975 Rio de Janeiro was a world away from the fog-choked ramparts of Alcatraz, yet it was here that the ghosts of the Rock finally stepped into the light. For over a decade, the Anglin brothers had been spectral figures, their names whispered in hushed tones by family members who claimed to receive unsigned Christmas cards with no return address. The breakthrough came via Fred Brizzi, a childhood friend and occasional substance smuggler who had grown up with the Anglins in the Florida Everglades. Brizzi claimed that while scouting clandestine landing strips in the Brazilian interior, he encountered 2 men who looked remarkably familiar. They weren't hiding in a bunker or a basement. They were living as ranchers, their skin bronzed by the South American sun, their identities shielded by the vast, unregulated frontiers of the Amazon basin. Brizzi's photograph, which sat in a private collection for decades before being released to the public in 2015, depicts 2 men standing near a roadside. They are lean, weathered, and sporting the quintessential 70s aesthetic: aviator sunglasses and shaggy, unkempt hair. To the casual observer, they could be any expatriates seeking a quiet life abroad. However, to the U.S. Marshals, this image represented the holy grail of cold case evidence. Brazil in the mid-70s was a sanctuary for those wishing to disappear. With its porous borders, burgeoning economy, and a government that rarely extradited to the United States without significant diplomatic pressure, it was the perfect Plan B for men who had spent their youth navigating the lawless swamps of the American South. The AI's validation of this photograph is the final piece of a logistical puzzle. If the Anglins made it to the Marin County shore, they would have needed a way out of the country. Speculation suggests they utilized the Underground Railroad of the 60s criminal world, potentially aided by the Whitey Bulger-connected Winter Hill Gang, who had ties to Alcatraz inmates. By hopping a merchant vessel or a freighter from a West Coast port, they could have reached South America in a matter of weeks. Once in Brazil, the brothers would have been able to blend into the large community of European and North American expats, using their mechanical skills to find work on remote farms or in the growing construction industry. This Brazilian trail isn't just a theory. It is supported by the eerie silence of the Anglin family. For years, the brothers' mother received flowers every Mother's Day, delivered without a card, from a source that could never be traced. At her funeral in 1973, 2 tall, heavily disguised women in veils reportedly stood at the back of the service, disappearing before anyone could speak to them. The Brizzi photograph provides visual confirmation of what the family likely already knew. The Anglins hadn't drowned in the bay. They had simply traded one island for a continent. The AI's match confirms that the men in the photo were not mere doppelgangers, but the same individuals who had defied the weight of the federal government. While the photograph in Brazil offered a visual link to the past, a handwritten plea from the future would soon arrive to challenge the authorities one last time. The 2013 letter. A voice from the grave. The most direct challenge to the FBI's drowning theory arrived not through an algorithm, but through the U.S. Postal Service. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a handwritten letter that sent shockwaves through the federal justice system. The author claimed to be John Anglin, one of the 3 men who had allegedly perished in the Bay 51 years prior. "My name is John Anglin," the letter began, written in a shaky but deliberate script. "I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. This wasn't a taunt from a prankster. It was a plea for a deal." The writer offered to serve no more than a year in prison in exchange for medical treatment, promising to reveal his exact location. The letter provided a rare, granular glimpse into the post-escape lives of the trio. According to the author, the 3 men lived together for years before eventually going their separate ways. Most notably, the letter claimed that Frank Morris had died in 2008 and was buried under a false name in Argentina, while Clarence Anglin had passed away in 2011. This timeline aligns perfectly with the AI's 1975 photograph, placing the men in South America during their middle age. If the letter is authentic, it confirms that the perfect blueprint didn't just get them across the bay, it got them across the hemisphere. The writer's admission of illness and his brother's deaths added a layer of somber reality to a story usually draped in the glamour of a Hollywood heist. However, the forensic analysis of the letter was agonizingly inconclusive. The FBI's laboratory examined the paper for DNA and fingerprints, but found nothing that could definitively link it to the 1962 inmate. Handwriting experts compared the 2013 script to John Anglin's prison records, but 5 decades of aging and the tremors of illness had altered the stroke patterns too significantly for a 100% match. Despite the lack of a smoking gun, the U.S. Marshals did not dismiss the letter as a hoax. They treated it with the gravity of a deathbed confession, acknowledging that the details, specifically the locations and the timeline of the brothers' deaths, matched intelligence gathered from other confidential sources over the decades. The existence of the letter creates a haunting paradox. If the man who wrote it was indeed John Anglin, it means a federal fugitive lived a full, unpunished life right under the nose of the world's most powerful law enforcement agencies. It suggests that the Great Escape was a total victory, leaving the authorities to chase shadows while the culprits grew old in the sun. The letter stands as a final, taunting testament to the fact that while the prison was closed in 1963, the case of its most famous residents remains wide open. While the letter provided a haunting narrative of their survival, it is the modern mandate of the U.S. Marshals that keeps the hunt alive well into the 21st century. The Marshals Hunt. The Federal Bureau of Investigation may have walked away from the shoreline in 1979, but the United States Marshals Service never stopped looking. Under federal law, a warrant for an escapee does not expire until the individual is proven deceased or reaches the age of 100. For the Marshals, the AI's validation of the 1975 photograph wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was a modern directive. They have transitioned from a search for skeletal remains in the silt of the bay to a global intelligence operation targeting men who would now be in their mid-90s. The hunt has evolved into a high-tech game of where in the world, fueled by the realization that if the Anglin brothers survived the most treacherous swim in America, they likely had the grit to survive a century of life on the run. The Marshals' strategy relies on a combination of ancestral DNA and digital breadcrumbs. By monitoring the descendants of the Anglin family in Florida and Georgia, investigators look for sudden spikes in international travel or unexplained financial transfers. They are operating on the theory that even the most successful fugitives eventually reach a point of failure in their old age, a need for medical care, a desire to reconnect with kin, or a deathbed confession. The 2013 letter, regardless of its forensic ambiguity, forced the Marshals to re-examine their most wanted posters. They updated the age-progressed sketches of Morris and the Anglins, using the AI's structural analysis of the Brazil photo to create more accurate representations of what a 95-year-old John Anglin would look like today. Moreover, the Marshals have focused heavily on the Argentina connection mentioned in the 2013 letter. Working with Interpol, they have cross-referenced death certificates in South American provinces for men born in the early 30s who lack a clear paper trail before 1965. The search is a race against biology. Every year that passes increases the likelihood that the case will be closed by a natural death rather than handcuffs. Yet, the Marshals remain dogged. To them, the Alcatraz escape is the ultimate black eye on federal corrections. Capturing even one of the men or confirming their burial site would finally restore the integrity of the system. While the Marshals hunt for the men themselves, scientists have turned their attention back to the water, proving that the ocean might have been an accomplice rather than an executioner. The science of survival. The primary argument for the death of the Alcatraz 3 has always been the water itself, a churning industrial-strength vacuum that supposedly pulls everything toward the abyss of the Pacific. For decades, the FBI relied on the death by geography theory, asserting that the bay's currents were too chaotic for a raincoat raft to navigate. However, modern oceanography has dismantled this certainty. In 2014, a team of researchers from Delft University in the Netherlands utilized 3D hydraulic modeling to simulate the bay's exact tidal conditions on the night of June 11, 1962. They discovered that the timing of the escape wasn't just lucky. It was mathematically perfect. Had the men launched before midnight, the outgoing tide would have swept them to certain death. But if they entered the water between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, the slack water window provided a literal bridge to survival. During this specific window, the model showed that the currents shifted, pushing any floating object directly toward the North Tower of the Golden Gate Bridge. This scientific revelation aligns perfectly with the discovery of a lone paddle found near Angel Island. Rather than evidence of a capsized vessel, the paddle's location suggests the men were using the eddy currents to steer toward a landing point in Marin County. The science of fluid dynamics suggests that the bay, often viewed as a barrier, actually functioned as a conveyor belt. If the trio paddled with the tide rather than against it, they would have reached the shore with enough body heat to survive the initial cold shock and begin their overland journey. Furthermore, the hypothermia defense fails to account for the insulating properties of the materials the men used. The rubberized raincoats, double-layered and sealed with heat, acted as a rudimentary wetsuit for the raft's occupants. By staying mostly dry and huddled together, Morris and the Anglins could have mitigated the effects of the wind chill. The science of survival in 1962 was a matter of minutes and meters. The 2014 study proves that those minutes were on their side. The impossible swim becomes a calculated naval maneuver when viewed through the lens of modern tidal data, suggesting that the men didn't beat the ocean. They used its own momentum to carry them to freedom. While the science of the bay explains how they reached the shore, the ultimate fate of the trio's mastermind, Frank Morris, remains the most elusive piece of the puzzle. the legend of Frank Morris. If the Anglin brothers were the muscle and the maritime navigators of the 1962 escape, Frank Lee Morris was undoubtedly the ghost in the machine. A man with an IQ of 133, Morris was a career criminal who viewed prison not as a destination, but as a complex puzzle requiring a mechanical solution. While the AI has provided a 90% match for the Anglins in Brazil, Morris remains the most elusive figure in the entire saga. A shadow that refused to be captured even by a digital lens. According to the 2013 letter allegedly written by John Anglin, Morris lived out his final years in the high-altitude silence of Argentina, dying in 2008 and being laid to rest under a pseudonym. This narrative paints a picture of the ultimate vanishing act. A man who escaped the most secure prison in the world, crossed the equator, and successfully aged into obscurity, taking his secrets to a nameless grave in the shadow of the Andes. The legend of Frank Morris is more than just a story of a fugitive. It is the ultimate indictment of the inescapable myth of Alcatraz. For 55 years, the United States government maintained that the Rock was a closed loop, a place where the law was absolute and the geography was a death sentence. The AI's intervention has shattered that illusion, proving that with enough intellect and improvised engineering, the system's own weight can be used against it. Morris didn't just break out of a cell. He broke the psychological hold that the Bureau of Prisons had over the American public. By utilizing the 1975 photograph and modern facial recognition, we have moved past the era of presumed dead and into an era of forensic accountability. We now know that the failure of the FBI in 1962 wasn't a lack of effort, but a lack of imagination. They could not conceive of inmates who were smarter than the concrete holding them. The final legacy of the Alcatraz mystery is the intersection of 20th century grit and 21st century technology. The AI didn't just find two men in a photo, it validated the human capacity for survival against impossible odds. It confirmed that the dummy heads and raincoat rafts were not the desperate acts of drowning men, but the tools of successful pioneers. Today, Alcatraz stands as a hollowed-out tourist attraction, a skeletal reminder of a perfect system that was ultimately defeated by three men and a concertina bellows. As the U.S. Marshals continue to monitor the aging relatives of the Anglins and scour Argentinian death records for a trace of Morris, the message remains clear. The case isn't closed because the ocean failed, but because the human spirit succeeded. As we look back at the grainy images of 1975 and the digital matches of today, we are forced to admit that the greatest mystery in American history was solved not by a body floating in the bay, but by a face smiling in the Brazilian sun. The Rock has finally given up its ghosts, and they aren't at the bottom of the sea. They are among us. What do you think of the fate of the three men who escaped Alcatraz? Leave your comments below and subscribe to the channel for more.